Okay, so we're going to be moving on to topic 5.4 today. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution and where it spreads. And we all know from last time it started in the United Kingdom. So let's talk about what happens after that. So, while the Industrial Revolution does start in the United Kingdom and England in particular, it is going to spread into areas of the world, including Western Europe, the Americas, and East Asia. Industrialization looks very different everywhere where it ends up spreading to. And there's different systems that each country will follow that leads them towards a path of more industrialization. That will differ from what we see in England. And so, regardless of how it was done, it is no doubt that there has huge implications in transforming these countries economically, politically, socially, culturally, all over the world in different ways. So, we're going to talk about today some of these countries and where and why it does spread a little bit to that. So, as new methods of industrial production become more common and in the parts of Northwest Europe, they spread to other parts of Europe and into the United States, Russia, and Japan. So let's talk about some of these individually. Let's start with France and Germany. So France and Germany, have all the right recipes to be able to industrialize, similar to what England's going on. I think a big difference between the two is that England was much more politically stable than these two countries were. And we recall from previous lectures, we had the idea of what France is going through with the French Revolution, and then followed by the Napoleonic Wars and such. These are things that end up distracting them from being able to industrialize the same way and same pace that England does. And then you talk about Germany, which Germany was a really fragmented state for a very long time because of the whole Protestant Reformation and so forth. But in 1871, when it is united under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, it does lead them to becoming an industrialized country very quickly. And by the time that World War I has taken place, Germany is probably the most industrialized country in Europe as a continent. So, moving on to the United States. And the United States is something, for those of you who are going to take U.S. history next year as well as AP U.S. history, which I hope you do, you'll learn a lot more about this stuff in much more grander detail than what I will be presenting to you in this lecture today. But the United States has really perfect conditions for industrialization, and they don't start that much later than what we see in England. The big difference is that England already had a pretty stable political structure and economic structure because the United States is a fairly new country. It doesn't become an independent country until 1783. And some of you will say 1776, but there's a reason 1783, look it up. But the first factory that you find in the United States is going to be found in Rhode Island, a place called Cider Mill. And from there, the United States will continue to industrialize over time. And new technologies that start in England will make their way into the United States, and the Americans will also add into technologies as well. It's not until after the Civil War do you see the Industrial Revolution really take off. And a lot of that has to do with the victory of the North, which was a more industrialized side of the country, ends up becoming victorious. So the model for America's future really lies in the victory to the North. But you also see other products that come about that help add to industrialization. Cotton gin, which was important in technology for a lot of reasons, but in the case of what we're talking about today, it created the idea of interchangeable parts. One part breaks, you don't have to change out. The whole thing's not broken. You can change out that one part, replace it, and then it can continue to work. So that is something that becomes more integral in the building of machinery that's going to help make these systems work. You also have, the idea of Cincinnati system, which, is like an early version of the assembly line where everyone has a specific job, and every job that they do is, over and over again, and makes it much more efficient and much more quickly. It was invented in Cincinnati, butcher factories where they would be butchering meat, pigs in particular, and everyone had a job, and they would, one person would hang the pig up on a rafter, and then one person would cut their throat. And I'm sorry if you are vegetarian or vegan or something. I'm just simply stating this is how the system worked. And everybody had their own cut that they had to make on that. And then by the time you get it, you have a product that went from animal to things that are packaged and bought readily in the store. And then, of course, the assembly line comes later and used and popularized by Henry Ford in the Ford Motor Company, making cars more affordable for all people. And then, of course, the steamboat is going to be something that is invented in the United States as well, has huge implications on migration patterns as well as trade. So another invention that really adds into the Industrial Revolution. But by the end of this 1800s and then by 1900 itself, the United States is leading the world in industrialized power, and it is fueled largely by the amount of raw materials they have available to them, including oil, coal, and iron, and of course a workforce that is ever growing, especially due to immigration. And so many people who immigrate to the United States work in these factories. You have cheap, readily available workers at all times. And so that is something that continues to fuel the Industrial Revolution in the United States. This is a painting of Samuel Slater's mill, and you can see it is a mill, so it was requiring the water, and you can see the steady streams here would then help power the factory itself. And then, of course, over time, new inventions like the steam engine will allow factories to go away from the water and more out into just about any part. But the early factories always tended to be towards near waterways. The United States had plenty of waterways that had fast-moving streams that could power these machinery of the factories themselves. All right, then we move to Russia. So Russia's industrial revolution is really slow when you compare it to other countries as well. Russia itself, with the political systems that they have there, I mean, industrialization is not at the forefront of their thoughts. But over time, they do begin to industrialize, and a lot of the industrialization really kind of stems from the whole building of railroads and extending trade to faraway places like East Asia. And so one invention that is definitely worth noting, and it's why it's in bold, is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And the Trans-Siberian Railroad was able to go from Moscow all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Considering how much of an expanse of this land is and how difficult this land is to live in and to work in, is quite an impressive feat. But this allowed trade to happen with East Asian countries, and that's an important, buoy to more industrialization. It gives them more access to different parts of the country that allow them to get more coal, more iron, and other things that help fuel the raw materials that help fuel their industrialization. But even with that said, in 1900, they're the fourth largest producers of steel in the world. So they were behind, and despite all of this, Russia largely, their economy revolves around agriculture, and that's something that will continue until we get to the era of Russian history where they become the communist Russia, the Soviet Union, right? And then that leads us to our last country we're going to talk about in specifics today, and that is Japan. And Japan was the first East Asian country to industrialize as well. And it's funny because China, you'd think would China be the one, but China had been, the manufacturing center of the world for a very long time. So they didn't feel the need to fix what wasn't broke for a while until, much later. And so the, Japanese are going to undertake their own industrialization in what becomes known as the Meiji Restoration. So if you recall what we've talked about Japanese history and the Tokugawa shogunate in particular, they had isolated themselves from the rest of the world for several hundred years. But when Matthew C. Perry, the American Commodore, arrives in Tokyo Bay with the iron ships that they were sailing in 1853, it becomes very apparent to the Japanese and their leadership that they have fallen behind in the world and technologically. And they understood that if they wanted to be able to protect their heritage and culture, they must adapt to the new world that is developing all around them. And so they put together a mission, a diplomatic mission. The Awakura mission was something that was made up of statesmen, diplomats, as well as scholars, several hundred of them. And they go on this mission to travel across the world. They even come through Salt Lake. They actually, the longest place they stayed during this mission was in Salt Lake City. And just kind of like how we can connect our local history to this world history curriculum, which is rare. They stayed in Salt Lake City because weather trapped them for 19 days. And, they met with leaders of the church. They met with local officials. So a lot of the things that they learned in their mission, come from parts of Utah. And so I like to think that, in their time here, that they learned some things that adopted into their own system of industrialization as well. But the mission itself was to go see what the rest of the world was doing, and they learned some things in doing so. And so when they do model their own industrialization, they take ideas from Europe and America, but they do it on their own. And that's something that's really important to note, is that the Japanese were determined to industrialize themselves. Rather than having somebody do it for them, they're going to do it themselves. And that way they could hold on to their cultural identity. And by the early 1900s, Japan is a full-fledged industrial power, and it's going to open people's eyes when they eventually get into a war with Russia, and they beat the pants off of Russia, and everyone thinks, oh man, the Japanese have arrived, and something that will continue to be so. Even today, Japan is one of the most industrialized and successful economies in the world. This is a painting. This is Matthew C. Perry's Black Ships. Of course, they're the iron ships. You can see the steamships that they are here, but their arrival, which doesn't look like it's a happy arrival, certainly opens their eyes to the fact that they must adapt. So, the rapid development of the steam-powered industrial production in the European countries and the U.S. contributed to the increase in these regions' share of global manufacturing, including the Industrial Revolution, something we just talked about just now. While the Middle East and Asian countries continue to produce manufactured goods, these regions' share in global manufacturing ultimately does decline. And that's an important thing to know. Now, I didn't go into much detail because I'm going to rely on Ben Freeman's graphics here to give you a basic understanding of how that looks. So, in India, they had huge shipbuilding yards, and it's definitely, with the arrival of the British, expands more so. However, over time, you start to see, while they were once like the number one ship producing areas in the world, they're going to fall behind to European and American shipbuilding yards, and that's something it's important to note that there's a major shift in the economic might in the world this time, where it's shifting from these regions, especially in just these examples here, towards Europe and America. And so that's a huge change that occurs in this period, where for the longest time, India or South Asia and East Asia, China in particular, had been the manufacturing superpowers for the longest time. The Middle East, especially under the era of Darul Islam, they were huge manufacturers, traders, producers, but it's all shifting more towards Europe now. The ironworks in India will also shift because of colonization, imperialism, and then problems within the Mughal Empire as well. And then textile production will also shift a little bit more. So Egypt continues to be, and we'll learn about in later lectures, continues to be major producers of cotton, but now they're not manufacturing into textiles. They're taking the raw materials, they're shipping them back to Europe and England, where England, of course, is the major textile industry, is their huge industry to start with, and then they manufacture it. So there's this massive shift that's going on in manufacturing. Okay. So you may have noticed there's no essential questions for today. That's okay. We're just going to do the lecture. Make sure you know the information and make sure you make good notes of this. You will obviously see these on tests later on, but that is it from Mr. Henry, and I will see you all later.